Americans are less religious than ever. So why have so many recent political speeches sounded like sermons?
Religion and Christianity are the biggest things missing from this country.
God is the one that raises up people in authority, and he sets down others.
Stand up, speak out, and pray that God will bless America again.
The court cited Alabama's Constitution in its ruling, saying even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory.
Christ, not Congress, will be what saves this country.
And I think you all should get a copy of God Bless the USA Bible now and help spread our Christian values.
Politicians have always leaned on religious rhetoric to some extent. It's a convenient shortcut to signaling morality and connecting with devout constituents. But lately, the intensity of this religious rhetoric feels like it's ramping up and spreading. Explicitly Christian language has been popping up in court decisions, eroding the wall of separation carefully built between church and state through hundreds of years of precedent. And it has a lot of you in my comments section feeling pretty freaked out, and I think rightfully so. Isn't religious freedom kind of one of our big things? If Americans are so much less religious, why are conservative Christians so overrepresented in Congress? Today, we're digging into the history of the separation of church and state in America to figure out why we separated church and state in the first place, why the lines between them have gotten so fuzzy, and what we can do to rebuild the wall. Get it? Roll the intro. What if I told you that you can get fresh, gourmet, chef-prepared meals delivered straight to your door this summer? Basically, like you have your own personal chef. That's literally how I feel with Factor, my partner on today's video. Summer is upon us, okay? And I am sweaty, so I do not want to be in the kitchen. Factor makes it easier by delivering fresh, never frozen meals that take just 2 minutes to heat up in the microwave. No cooking, no cleaning, easy. Love that for me. Love that for you. I just tried their mushroom chicken thighs and wild rice, and yeah, I threw it all into a bowl with the side of perfectly cooked green beans underneath it that come with it. Does it look great on camera when I serve it this way? No. But is it delicious? You bet your summer butt cheeks it is, baby. And Factor is customizable to your needs with 35 meals to choose from every week and plans that include vegan and vegetarian, keto, and more. So you can get the deliciousness and convenience no matter what your dietary needs are. So what are you even waiting for? A fancy summer of chef-prepared meals awaits you. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code Leeja50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Thanks, Factor. In 1922, one British observer called the United States a nation with the soul of a church. That was nearly 130 years after the Bill of Rights banned the establishment of a national religion. But why would a country supposedly founded on religious freedom have such a distinctly churchy vibe? To find out, we'll examine what the founding fathers had to say, but first, we need to follow the threads of church and state all the way back to the earliest days of their unification. And yeah, we're going way back. Conservatives are always talking about historical tradition and going back to the way things were, so yeah, let's go there. What really is our historical tradition? During its first 3 centuries, Christianity was banned by the Roman state. Yeah, that's how far we're going back, okay? Buckle up. But then the Emperor Constantine came to power and got fully on board with the church thanks to a classic, I prayed and then I won a battle so now I believe conversion story. Within a few short decades, it was the business of the empire to help establish Christian orthodoxy, and political leaders were expected to support and sponsor Christianity without exception. In the early 400s, St. Augustine of Hippo argued that secular rulers not only could but should deploy coercion to sustain Christian orthodoxy. He believed that the church should discipline its people out of a loving desire to heal them, and that once compelled to come in, heretics would gradually give their voluntary assent to the truth of Christian orthodoxy. Becoming a state-sponsored religion enabled Christianity to conquer the world. For the next 1,000 years, it was broadly accepted that political and religious rulers should collaborate to crush dissent and enforce Christian unity. And the system worked fine. People were either Christian or they got crusaded to death. Easy. Until in the 16th century, yes, we're jumping like 1,000 years. If you want a full history of the Crusades, there's actually a really great 3-hour lecture series on YouTube, but that's not what you wanted when you clicked on this video. So honestly, you're welcome for sparing you. Anyway, in the 16th century, a bunch of meddlesome magistrates kicked off the Protestant Reformation and caused all kinds of chaos, establishing new Christian denominations left and right. But even as new delicious flavors of Christianity proliferated, the underlying logic of a unified church and state still prevailed. In fact, the religious liberty angle we often associate with the early colonists' motivations was rooted in various Christian groups' desire to dominate the political sphere in a way their minority faiths couldn't in England. When Queen Elizabeth I came to power in 1558, her kingdom was religiously confused, to put it mildly. After decades of bouncing back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism, Queen Elizabeth had had enough, so she re-established the Church of England and passed the Act of Uniformity, which established the Church of England as the one true faith and required all British subjects to support the church in public worship. While they were allowed to believe what they wanted in private, many devout members of religious minorities refused to declare the Church of England as the one true faith, and they were the ones who headed west to settle the New World according to their religious vision. This only worked because England didn't run its own colonization projects. Instead, it allowed private companies to take the lead and run the show on the ground in the New World. So while the Spanish, for example, funded their own explorations, automatically planting Catholicism wherever they landed, the British colonists were encouraged to run things how they saw fit, just as long as taxes kept flowing back across the pond. The character of each colony in the New World was determined by its sponsors and the settlers those sponsors recruited to populate it, not by the British monarchy. It was because of this that the Massachusetts Bay Company brought Puritans to Plymouth Rock, while the Virginia Company of London introduced the Church of England to the Chesapeake Bay. As I said, each of the colonies was fully committed to an integrated church and state. The land in the New World was just so expansive that in the early years it was possible to spread out enough to maintain the illusion that each colony had successfully planted their one true religion within their domain. It was only when the colonies wanted to unite that the idea of separating church and state even entered the chat. Between 1700 and 1740, when most of our founding fathers were growing up, as much as 80% of the American population attended church regularly. Most of them were Protestants, raised in one of the three most popular denominations in the colonies: Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, or Congregationalism. Most were baptized church members married to other church members and didn't hesitate to invoke the divine in public statements. However, they were also highly educated and therefore exposed to deism, a school of thought that gained popularity during the Enlightenment as scientific inquiry and rationalism came into vogue. Deism accepts the idea of a divine creator, but rejects the notion that such a figure interferes with human activity and daily life, instead centering human rationality and logic as the ultimate source of truth. But even among deism's most prominent advocates, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, to name a few, Christianity remained a driving force. Adams described himself as a church-going animal, while Jefferson, widely considered the most deist of the founders, openly claimed that religion and morality were essential for both citizen and state. No nation has ever yet existed or been governed without religion. Nor can it be, he said. The Christian religion is the best religion that has ever been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example. Religious convictions in early America were as deeply held as they were distinct. Since it was hard enough to get the colonies to agree on a governing structure, the founders sidestepped religion as much as possible in the drafting of the Constitution. All the original document says about religion comes from Article 6, prohibiting religious tests for federal office holders. However, at the time, even Article 6 was controversial, as it was seen as both too restrictive by some and not restrictive enough by others of state-supported religion. But it was the guys keen to avoid the entanglement of church and state who made the bigger fuss, later putting so much pressure on the members of the First Federal Congress that they wrote the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause into the First Amendment, which forbids Congress to make any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Note that the focus here is on the freedom to practice one's chosen religion, a groundbreaking liberty that made it possible to create a nation of United States despite its considerable religious pluralism for the time. The founders didn't conceive of a world where people chose no religion. Instead, secular government was seen as the best way to preserve and promote the practice of religion, avoiding the abuses of state-sanctioned churches while asserting the country's core value of freedom. Enlightenment-era logic emphasized independent thought and individual choice. Thomas Jefferson went so far as to say it would be downright sinful to force a person to support a religion that propagates opinions he disagrees with. Though of course it's important to question the religious knowledge and propensity of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, given that they were on board with, for example, owning humans. Though I guess the Bible is filled with slavery, so look, I know the Founding Fathers fetish is pervasive in this country, but I just feel like it's important to remember that these were flawed men raised in a very different world, and we don't actually need to take their words as gospel, okay? Anyway, his many shortcomings as a Christian aside, Jefferson's most important comment on the separation of church and state came in 1802, in a letter he wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. This letter, and not the Constitution, gave us the iconic language of a wall of separation between church and state. This phrase appears nowhere in the Constitution, but the phrase caught on quickly. In 1831, when French jurist turned politician Alexis de Tocqueville sailed to the U.S. to study the democratic institutions of the newborn country, he noted the uniquely intimate relationship religion had with democracy. In the United States, religion not only informs people's habits, but it even influences their way of thinking. Everyone in America attributes their country's quiet empire of religion mainly to the complete separation of church and state. The next time federal law addressed religion was in 1868, when the 14th Amendment extended the protection of religious freedom to state governments. In 1913, the 16th Amendment passed, giving Congress the right to levy a national income tax, which led to the formalization of the long-standing tradition of exempting religious organizations from taxes. That's a whole can of worms that deserves and will get its own video, but I mention it to point out that underlying every other law and argument and decision that we're going to discuss in today's video, the fact that the government has made enormous investments in protecting religion via the tax code is important, but also that while our founding fathers were concerned with the separation of church and state, the point was not so much to protect people from practicing any religion at all, and more so to protect the free practice of religion generally. Despite this separation, that the people would all practice some form of religion was kind of a foregone conclusion, and the freedom to not practice any religion wasn't really at the forefront of their minds. Even still, they vehemently opposed the state imposing a specific religion onto its own people. That's the basis of the colonization of this land and was very much on the minds of the men who wrote the Constitution of this country. The U.S. has had numerous periods of religious revival in its short history. Even before the writing of the Constitution, the first revival started in the 1730s and was rooted in conservative backlash to the growing prominence of heretical Enlightenment philosophies, like the deism that would inform our founding fathers. Near the end of that century came the Second Great Awakening, characterized by emotive preaching and the promise of salvation. New denominations, including the Latter-day Saints, emerged during this period. The Third Great Awakening is the one that they probably taught you about in public school. Lasting from the late 1890s through the 1920s, this period saw the rise of Pentecostalism and an explosion of Christian activism. This was the era of the social gospel movement, which offered a religious rationale for addressing social ills. Around the same time, the temperance movement was also gathering steam. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded to organize women around alcoholism as a family issue. 50 years later, in 1919, they got their wish when the 18th Amendment was passed, prohibiting the sale, manufacture, and transport of alcohol, except of course for churches. They got to keep the blood of Christ as alcoholic as they wanted. The 1920s also brought the popularization of radio, and evangelicals jumped at the opportunity to broadcast their messages to the masses. Controversial radio stars like Sister Amy McPherson, Billy Sunday, and Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin became the first conservative Christian celebrities. Then in 1925, John Scopes was found guilty of violating a Tennessee state law that banned the teaching of Darwinian evolution in biology classrooms. Technically, evangelicals came out on top in the Scopes case. The verdict was upheld by the Supreme Court. Tennessee could go on banning evolution in classrooms, but the press had a field day mocking fundamentalists for their strict interpretation of the Bible. Embarrassing. And as a result, many conservative Protestants retreated from national politics, opting instead to organize quietly behind the scenes. In the 1930s and 40s, evangelical leaders focused on building relationships with more mainstream Christian leaders in the National Council of Churches, as well as economically conservative businessmen who shared their objections to a liberalizing world. Combining free market economics, small government, and Christian values, they established a massive network of colleges, media outlets, political action groups, and para-church organizations that still pull political strings to this day. After World War II, Americans flocked to church in record numbers as the country slipped into the Cold War. And maybe part of this was an earnest desire to feel close to God after experiencing the horrors and losses of war, but a lot of it was about social pressure and control. Communism became associated with sin and atheism. Communist quickly became shorthand for any sinful behavior considered disruptive to the status quo. Post-war, many women struggled with being sent back to the kitchen after successfully keeping the American economy afloat during wartime. Black people were rightfully miffed to return to life under the Jim Crow social order after fighting heroically for their country. Homosexuality was positioned as a moral failure that made gays untrustworthy. All of these sinful, devious behaviors were looked upon with an air of fear. The gays, the women's lib wackos, and the blacks were all morally bereft and could therefore be infiltrated easily by the commies. That being said, by the late 1940s, the Supreme Court began what would be a decidedly anti-religion streak of decisions that would last through the 1970s. In 1947, in Everson v. Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "The Establishment of Religion Clause in the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government may set up a church. Neither can pass laws that aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force a person to go to or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion." In the words of Jefferson, the clause against the establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. In writing this, the court wrote into the Constitution the words of Jefferson, emphasizing the importance of the separation of church and state. This is important because those words do not exist in our Constitution. In writing this decision, the court said, even if they're not in there explicitly, that's what the First Amendment means. The subsequent decisions the court would make, further solidifying this separation between church and state, would prove to be incredibly unpopular, especially among religious conservatives. Religious conservatives exalted the traditional, nuclear Christian family as the bulwark against the spread of atheistic communism. Unrelenting propaganda juxtaposed evil, godless communists against pious, democracy-loving Americans. In advertising, film, and public addresses, church-going became emblematic of American patriotism. In 1954, we added the words "One Nation Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. 2 years later, we adopted the national motto "In God We Trust," a sign of how fervently the government was interested in solidifying godliness as part of the national identity. And I don't think anyone at the time or now understands the God referenced in "One Nation Under God" and "In God We Trust" to be anything other than a Christian God. Even Senator Red Scare McCarthy himself described the anti-communist movement as an all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. After the Red Scare and anti-communist mayhem of the 1950s died down, by the end of the hippie and civil rights-driven 1960s, enrollment at mainstream churches was declining, but conservative evangelism was on the rise. Eager to convert as many new souls as possible, evangelicals seamlessly transitioned from radio to television, harnessing conservative backlash to civil rights progress. And yet, the Supreme Court did not relent in continuing to build that wall between the church and the state. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled in 𝗬𝗒𝗧𝗏 v. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 that the state could not hold prayers in public schools, even if participation was optional and the prayer non-denominational. In his opinion for the majority, once again Justice Hugo Black wrote for the court, "It is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as a part of a religious program carried on by government." And according to legal scholars, this was the most unpopular Supreme Court decision ever made up to that point. The following year, the court ruled in Abington School District v. Schempp that requiring students to recite the Lord's Prayer and read the Bible in schools violated the First Amendment's establishment and free exercise clauses and was therefore unconstitutional. Madeleine Murray O'Hair, founder of American Atheists and the woman at the center of the Abington v. Schempp case, whom I made a whole video about, and her wild life and untimely demise, go watch that after this, was arguing for her son's freedom from the imposition of religion at school. But conservatives felt like something was being taken from them, their right to exercise their faith freely. 1968 brought another blow. In Epperson v. Arkansas, the Supreme Court struck down a law banning the teaching of evolution because it was only relevant to beliefs held by fundamentalist Christians. This marked a startling 180-degree turn from the Scopes decision just a few decades before. And then the punches just kept rolling in. In the landmark 1971 Supreme Court case Lemon v. Kurtzman, laws in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island granting government money to religious schools were ruled unconstitutional. The case also established the famous three-part Lemon test for determining whether whether the grant of federal funds violates the Establishment Clause. It goes like this. The government can only assist a religion if 1. The primary purpose of the assistance is secular, meaning non-religious, 2. The assistance neither promotes nor inhibits religion, and 3. There is no excessive entanglement between church and state. So the Lemon Test, in essence, wrote into judge-made law that there should be no excessive entanglement between the church and the state. And it made clear that any government laws or assistance must, at its core, be secular in nature and neither promote nor inhibit religion. But of course, promotion and inhibition must be balanced. But we'll get to that. The Lemon Test wasn't even the bitterest pill the religious right had to swallow that year. Also in 1971, Green v. Connolly hit the Supreme Court and devastated the conservative Christian right by closing the loopholes it had meticulously crafted to uphold segregation after separate but equal was ruled unconstitutional in 1954. In the wake of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, Christian leaders, including certified piece of shit and future moral majority founder Jerry Falwell, argued that practicing segregation was a matter of religious freedom. Let me say that again. Practicing segregation was a matter of religious freedom. Okay? So they set up segregated church-affiliated private academies all over the South and enjoyed tax breaks through the religious ties while skirting the segregation ban. And life was great. Until a group of black parents in Mississippi filed a lawsuit arguing that schools practicing discrimination shouldn't be tax exempt. Rude. But the Supreme Court agreed. And before the Christian right knew what hit them, President Nixon had ordered the IRS to revoke tax exemptions for segregated schools. Evangelicals had been politically awakened, and their resolve to put things right only escalated with the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Contrary to popular belief, it was not Roe v. Wade in itself that precipitated the collective action of the Christian right. It was the tax exemption issue. They were way more mad about not being allowed to be overtly racist anymore than they were about dead babies. It was only later that abortion became the rallying cry and wedge issue that it is today. And as the countercultural revolution continued into the 70s, with hippies and radicals experimenting with free love, Eastern spirituality, and plenty of drugs, Christian conservatives clenched their collective butthole and started getting organized. Did you know on Patreon you can get early access to these videos ad-free? Thank you to my Patreon community and my YouTube members for supporting the research and work that goes into these videos. Consider checking out my Patreon community or clicking the join button below to become a member here on YouTube. You'll be supporting my work and getting access to early, ad-free, uncensored versions of all these videos, as well as access to my research and all my sources, exclusive live streams, and more. Your support helps to keep these videos free for everyone and further our mission towards legal and political education for all. In 1979, at the request of conservatives within the Republican Party, Jerry Falwell launched the Moral Majority, the first advocacy group to activate Christian voters on a national scale. Within its first year, the Moral Majority mobilized in 47 states and boasted several million members by leveraging a playbook of familiar tactics, including lobbying, campaign donations, and boosting aligned candidates. And there was no more aligned candidate than old Ronald fucking Reagan. He was in favor of constitutional amendments to ban abortion and put prayer back in public schools. And with 2/3 of evangelical voters in his corner, 69-year-old Reagan became the oldest first-time president America had ever elected. Luckily, the old man had a cheat sheet waiting for him in the form of a 3,000-page tome entitled The Mandate for Leadership, courtesy of his favorite think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Yes, they're the same group spearheading Project 2025. In fact, Project 2025 is modeled off the success of Reagan's Mandate for Leadership. Obviously, Reagan didn't get around to those abortion and school prayer amendments, but we can thank the religious right for suggesting across-the-board tax cuts to revitalize the national economy. Great idea, guys. But even with a Christian nationalist yes man in the White House, the Supreme Court remained on a decidedly strong separation of church and state kick. In 1984, it found in Lynch v. Donnelly that any government action appearing to endorse or disapprove of a religion is unconstitutional. In 1985, it was ruled that a moment of prayer violates the Lemon Test and is therefore unconstitutional. By the end of the decade, the Moral Majority had disbanded and a new organization had formed to pick up the torch of evangelical political action. Founded in 1987, the Christian Coalition focused on organizing evangelicals at the grassroots level. Over a decade later, they saw an opportunity in George W. Bush, an evangelical Methodist who seemed perfectly aligned with their goals. And early in his presidency, he did sign bills restricting embryonic stem cell research and banning late-term abortions. He even established the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. But then 9/11 happened, and foreign policy took priority. When Democrat John Kerry lost to Bush in 2004, Democrats were getting fired up about national politics at exactly the same moment that evangelicals were feeling disillusioned and tuning out. And then, in 2008, we elected our first black president. And on top of that, his name was Barack Hussein Obama. The backlash was brutal. During Obama's presidency, we got 2 new female Supreme Court justices, federal legalization of gay marriage, and programs like DACA and the Affordable Care Act. It was basically the civil rights movement all over again. Conservative Christians' perception of their own victimization hit the stratosphere. So they channeled all that rage, disappointment, and fear into someone they could relate to. Someone who was committed to making bigotry cool again. Most of the cases we've discussed so far have dealt with separating church and state to protect the public from religion, but people also generally have the right to worship freely within certain legal confines. In cases focused on a person's right to worship freely, courts have long been clear that just because you have a religious belief doesn't mean you can't be held legally liable if that religious belief violates the law. Take, for example, the 1879 Supreme Court ruling in Reynolds v. United States. Even though polygamy was a sincerely held tenet of the plaintiff's Mormon religion, the court held that Congress still had the right to outlaw the practice. They just couldn't stop his belief in the correctness of said practice. So if you believe that, I don't know, cannibalism makes you immortal, that's fine. But if you act on that belief, you're still going to prison for a very long time. So even in the 1870s, the excuse of, but it's my religion, wouldn't fly to absolve criminal behavior. But I guess in 2024, that's a different story. In recent years, we've seen a shift towards weaponizing the free exercise of religion as a way to get away with bigoted, unconstitutional, unconscionable, and arguably criminal behavior. Added bonus that a host of other civil rights are also being eroded along the way. In May 2017, Trump issued a so-called religious freedom executive order that attempted to totally destroy the Johnson Amendment, a 1954 federal law banning tax-exempt nonprofits, including churches, from intervening in partisan politics or commenting on candidates. But since an executive order can't overrule federal law, that part was largely symbolic. The executive order went on to call on then AG Jeff Sessions to issue guidance for all federal agencies regarding the scope of religious freedom protections in federal law. The intention was obvious: sanctioning the use of religion as an excuse to strip long-established equal rights protections. And the next 4 years saw the Trump administration justifying bigoted, unprecedented, harmful policies like denying access to healthcare, taxpayer-funded discrimination, and an erosion of LGBTQ civil rights under the guise of religious freedom. More damage came later after Trump left office and his hundreds of judicial appointees really started stretching their legs. 2022 was a banner year for batshit religious freedom cases in the Supreme Court. Among the most ludicrous was 303 Creative v. 𝗓𝗧. The case was brought by a graphic designer planning to start making wedding websites through her graphic design business. The designer filed a lawsuit seeking an injunction against the state of Colorado to ensure that she wouldn't be forced under the state's Anti-Discrimination Act to create wedding websites for any gay or otherwise unacceptable couples. And the court found in her favor. This despite the fact that the issue hadn't even come up for her yet. She wasn't making wedding websites and no gay couple had asked her to. And her design skills were deplorable. So it was a stretch for her to say, well, of course the gays will come flocking to me. I have to be protected from them. But also that the court was willing to hear the case at all, given how incredibly tenuous her standing was, is incredibly concerning. Standing rules require that the person bringing the lawsuit has actually suffered some sort of harm from which they are seeking redress. So you can't see a law that you don't agree with and then sue to try to get rid of that law. You have to actually have been harmed. She had not yet been harmed, but the Supreme Court was like, it's fine. This is just one example of how this current court is willing to stretch the rules of standing if it means getting its fingies in cases that will further a conservative agenda. The other arena the religious right loved to target is education. That same year, 2022, the Supreme Court issued 2 major decisions regarding religion and education: Carson v. Macon and Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. In the Carson case, the court ruled that Maine violated the free exercise clause when it prohibited students from using a state-run tuition assistance program to attend religious schools. The door to this decision was first pried open by a different case in 2002, which held that students could redeem government vouchers at religious schools without violating the Establishment Clause. That ruling made it permissible for the state to fund religious schools, but Carson was an escalation. It required the state to fund religious education alongside other options, and saying it to not provide that funding was a violation of the students' right to exercise their religion freely. In the Kennedy decision, the court held that a public school district violated a football coach's rights to free speech and free exercise when it sanctioned him for praying on the field after games. In the decision, the court declared that the 3-part Lemon test had been abandoned long ago by the court, and there was nothing in the Constitution that protected the school district's right to prohibit an innocent, sweet football coach from quietly saying little prayers to himself after football games. In her dissenting opinion, 𝗖𝗎𝗪 called the majority's bluff, saying they willfully misconstrued the facts of the case, ignoring the fact that the record shows Kennedy was not innocently whispering prayers to himself. He was stopping the proceedings of football games at a public high school to hold public prayers at the 50-yard line and leading his students in those prayers as well, at a public school. Remember all those cases we talked about, especially in the 70s, that repeatedly confirmed that a school cannot sanction prayers, that it violates the rights of the students to be free from religion? Yeah, the majority just fully ignores that precedent. Not only that, they set up a new test. The new test looks to history and tradition to determine whether something violates the freedom of religion. This conservative court loves looking to history and tradition. What's convenient about looking to history and tradition, as opposed to, I don't know, the law and precedent, is that you can cherry pick history to fit whatever narrative you want. And this conservative court does just that. They did it when they overturned Roe v. Wade, and they did it again in Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, skirting over not only decades of Supreme Court precedent, but also the very words of our founding fathers, who were opposed to the imposition of religion on the citizenry, who coined the very phrase separation between church and state, and instead pointed to a whole bunch of bullshit that they claimed made it abundantly clear that in our history and tradition, a public school football coach should definitely be able to pray during a school assembly. And where the facts blatantly do not conform to their new history and tradition argument, the court willfully ignores them. In her dissent in this case, 𝗖𝗎𝗪 writes, the court now charts a different path, yet again paying almost exclusive attention to the free exercise clause's protection for individual religious exercise, while giving short shrift to the Establishment Clause's prohibition on state establishment of religion. She goes on to say, this decision does a disservice to our nation's long-standing commitment to the separation of church and state. If you ever find a Supreme Court decision these days to be incredibly fucked, I encourage you to seek out the dissenting opinions of the case. More often than not, Justice 𝗖𝗎𝗪 is the voice of reason, laying bare the absolute fuckery happening on the highest court of the land in every dissent that she writes. It's both cathartic and disheartening to read her dissents, and I do not envy her job right now. In case after case, this Supreme Court has made it very clear that they do not care about facts, they do not care about precedent, and they don't even care about basic rules of standing. Nor do they care about trust in the institution as a whole, or even attempting to appear impartial. They have an agenda, and they're sticking to it. 250 years of precedent be damned. And this turn towards irresponsible judicial activism is clearest when it comes to the withering away of the long-established wall between church and state. Religion has a terrifying ability to justify just about anything. Genocide against Native Americans? Manifest destiny, baby. Slavery? Practically a favor. How else would the inferior races have found God and salvation? Rampant inequality? Prosperity gospel. If you got it, you must deserve it. And look, I'm not out here to fight anyone about their personal religion, believe what you want. My point is that religion is uniquely potent and therefore dangerous. And the US already grants people, well, certain people anyway, a huge amount of freedom to practice their beliefs, even to the point that their right to free expression bumps right up against other people's right to not be forced to practice a religion. These are all the states that allow religious or belief-based exemptions for school immunization requirements. In every one of the colored states, parents can say, no thank you, I would prefer not to vaccinate my child for measles or whooping cough or meningitis. And then their little crotch goblin just gets to skip off to public school without their shots, endangering everyone else. Super religious families enjoy a lot of freedom when it comes to isolating and indoctrinating their own children.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
And yet, conservative Christians have made it clear that that's not enough. The free exercise clause has been weaponized by the Christian right to strengthen their calls of victimization, to claim persecution at the hands of Democrats, to say their way of life is under attack, when in reality they are simply living under a government that has, for decades, made it very clear that imposing your religion upon someone else is never a right you had to begin with. Your rights cannot be under attack when they aren't your rights at all. They forget that they live in a society with other people, and so their freedom to practice religion must be balanced against the rest of our freedom from having religion imposed upon us. But that is unacceptable, and so the religious right has set to work not only systematically changing the laws in their favor, but also vilifying the groups that require them to compromise by balancing their freedom to and our freedom from religion. The gays and the trans kids require that the Christians allow them to exist, God forbid. The people who want to end their pregnancies require that the Christians allow them to exist. Notice that the trend is freedom from beneficiaries are simply trying to exist, while freedom to beneficiaries are trying to exert control over others. Basically, your freedom from having my religion imposed upon you is violating my freedom to practice my religion by imposing it upon you. Yes, Susan, that's how it works when you exist in a society of people who are different from you. Or I guess you could go the Nazi way and just try to exterminate the ones who are different from you. Oh, you're already trying to do that? Great. Cool. Another way you can tell that the encroachment of Christianity into the well-established separation of church and state is getting worse, not better, is because the population is less religious than ever, but our elected officials remain about as religious as they have ever been. Nearly 30% of Americans surveyed by Pew between 2020 and 2023 said they consider themselves religiously unaffiliated. Since 1980, the number of Americans who identify as Christians has dropped by more than 20 percentage points, from around 90% in 1980, on par with Congress that year, to 68% today. Yet 88% of the voting members of Congress today are Christians. That number has only dropped by 3% in the last 45 years. Why? I couldn't find a single straightforward answer about the cause of this overrepresentation phenomenon, but I have a theory. There are 3 major hurdles to running a successful campaign that I think being a church member would help a candidate overcome. 1, networking. Churches have listservs. Dwindling listservs, but listservs nonetheless. And being a member provides access to highly connected, very well-funded communities who don't have to pay those pesky taxes, and opportunities for reputation building. Like learning to golf or pretending to enjoy cigars, being a person of faith is a great way to rub elbows with powerful, wealthy, well-connected people. Number 2, moral proxy. Humans love patterns, almost as much as we hate thinking. So when a religion offers a shortcut to understanding something as consequential as a political candidate's moral compass, you're darn tootin' we're gonna take it. To many religious people, the idea that a person is capable of having a moral compass without being guided by a 2,000-year-old book is unthinkable. Where do you learn how to be a good person without it being beaten into you through shame and cult-like conformity to a belief system? Instead of politicians having to prove that they have a moral compass by walking the walk, they can just say, look, I'm a Christian man. I go to church every Sunday. And we somehow, despite years of proof to the contrary, believe that that automatically means that they are a good person led by a strong moral compass. And number 3, picky, active voters. White evangelicals are more politically active than the average population. More evangelicals are registered to vote, and more of those registered actually show up to cast a vote than the average eligible citizen. This means that even though white evangelicals represent a relatively small percentage of voters, their nearly unified bloc can have a major impact. A 2021 Pew survey found that 85% of white evangelical voters identify with or lean toward the GOP. In the past 3 decades, the share of white evangelicals who associate with the GOP has risen by 20 percentage points, and the share identifying as or leaning Democratic has declined by 20 percentage points. And who are these loyal Republicans eager to vote for? Another Pew survey found that among major religious groups, white evangelical Protestants were especially likely to find it important that political candidates shared their religious views. Americans are less religious across the board, regardless of age. But people over 65 are the most religious age group currently alive. They also vote more consistently than other age groups, especially in local elections. A 2021 study found that the average age of white evangelical Protestants in America was 56, the highest age of any denomination. So these folks are older, more organized, more politically active, more Republican, and more invested in religious alignment with their elected officials. When considered together, all these factors help explain the overrepresentation of Christians in Congress. So to answer the fervent questions in my comment section, yes, there is a separation of church and state. No, that doesn't mean that our elected officials have ever distanced themselves from their own religious identities, but yes, that means that we have decades of Supreme Court precedent establishing very clearly what the state can and cannot do in order to protect the general populace from having religion forced upon them, while balancing that same general populace's right to practice religion freely. However, in recent years, Christian conservatives have done everything in their power to do away with the freedom from religion and focus solely on the victimhood of the righteous Christian crusader who has been forced to bend the knee to the heathenist ways of the godless woke left. And it's only getting worse. So what do? Vote. Y'all, Project 2025 is no joke, and it will hit Trump's desk the day he enters office if he wins. We say Ronald Reagan ruined everything, but that was 45 years ago, and there's nothing we can do to change the past, but we can at the very least vote now to try to avoid me having to make t-shirts 40 years from now that say Trump ruined everything. Though frankly, by then if he wins, this place will likely be a burnt apocalyptic hellscape. Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas are both in their 70s, ripe for just conveniently and casually retiring, say, next year should Trump win the presidency, virtually ensuring another full generation of a conservative court with little deference to precedent or respect for the institution they represent. So for the love of God, vote. Stay vigilant, and prove that it's possible to be both moral and godless by supporting mutual aid and building community outside hierarchical church structures. Shout out to my newest supporters, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, T, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piantek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll also enjoy my video about how the religious right ruined everything. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.